Why distance from family can sometimes be part of God's plan. There are moments in life when the deepest pain does not come from enemies, strangers, or hardships. It comes quietly, from the growing distance within our own family. You may still share the same blood, the same memories, the same home, yet something has changed. Conversations become shorter, understanding becomes rarer, and the closeness you once felt slowly fades into silence. It is a painful silence, the kind that leaves questions in your heart. Why is this happening? Why do the people who once felt closest now feel so far away? But the Bible shows us that this experience is not unfamiliar. Again and again, God allows seasons where relationships shift, not because love disappears, but because purpose begins to unfold. Sometimes the path God prepares for you does not run alongside the expectations of those closest to you. And when that happens, distance can appear, not as rejection, but as refinement. Jesus spoke about this difficult truth with honesty. He said, "Do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword, for I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother." Matthew chapter 10 verses 34 to 36. These words are not a call to hatred. They are a reminder that loyalty to God can create tension, even within the deepest relationships. Following God sometimes means walking a path others do not understand. The Bible also says, "Anyone who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me." Matthew chapter 10 verse 37. This verse does not deny the value of family. It reveals something deeper. God must remain the highest place in our hearts. And when your heart begins to align more deeply with God's truth, something inside you changes. Your priorities shift. Your desires grow deeper. What once satisfied you no longer feels enough. Without even realizing it, you begin walking a road that feels unfamiliar, even to the people who raised you. This pattern appears throughout the Bible. When God called Abraham, He did not ask him to stay where everything felt safe and familiar. He told him to leave. "Go from your country, your people and your father's household to the land I will show you." Genesis chapter 12 verse 1. Abraham's calling required separation, not because his family was evil, but because his destiny was greater than comfort. Sometimes God's calling creates a spiritual distance before it creates visible change. Your family may still love you deeply, but they may not recognize the person you are becoming. As your faith grows, your conversations change, your values shift, your devotion deepens, and slowly, distance forms, not out of pride, but out of transformation. Jesus also said, "Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me." Matthew chapter 10 verse 38. The cross is not always public suffering. Sometimes it is the quiet loneliness of walking with God when others cannot walk beside you. That loneliness hurts, but it is not meaningless. It may be the very place where God is shaping your identity, strengthening your faith, and teaching you that His presence must come before every human connection. Sometimes the separation you never asked for becomes the soil where your spiritual calling begins to grow. There are also moments when distance becomes protection. Not every wound in a family is visible. Some harm is subtle: emotional pressure, constant criticism, discouragement of your faith, or expectations that slowly drain your spirit. When you cannot clearly see the danger, God sometimes intervenes by creating space. In the Bible, when Lot lived in Sodom, God sent angels to pull him away before destruction came. "Hurry, leave this place." Genesis chapter 19 verse 14. Leaving was painful, but staying would have been far worse. Sometimes distance is not abandonment. It is rescue. God sees what you cannot see. He understands what your soul can bear. And sometimes the only way to protect your faith is to create a quiet boundary between you and the influences that slowly weaken it. Distance does not mean you stop loving your family. It simply means your soul must survive. There are also seasons when God allows loneliness to teach you something deeper, to depend on Him alone. When the voices you once leaned on become silent, when the support you once had feels far away, you begin to discover where your trust truly rests. The psalmist once wrote, "Though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me." Psalm chapter 27 verse 10. God never replaces family, but He remains when every human relationship feels uncertain. And sometimes, when family support fades, a deeper intimacy with God begins to grow. The loneliness that once felt empty becomes filled with His presence. The silence becomes a place of encounter. Because God often prepares people for new assignments through separation. Before Moses led Israel, he spent years in the wilderness, far from Egypt, far from the life he once knew. Before Jesus began His ministry, He left the familiarity of Nazareth. And the Bible reminds us, "A prophet is not without honor except in his own town, among his relatives, and in his own home." Mark chapter 6 verse 4. Sometimes the people closest to you are the last to recognize your calling. Not because they do not love you, but because they remember who you used to be. When God distances you from familiar places and relationships, it may be because He is moving you toward a future they cannot yet imagine. The separation hurts, but it is also preparation. God is shaping your spirit for responsibilities that require faith beyond comfort. And one day, you may look back and realize something unexpected. The distance you feared was the doorway God used to lead you closer to Him, closer to your purpose, closer to the person He created you to become. Because in God's hands, even painful separation is never wasted. Sometimes what feels like loss is actually the beginning of a greater plan. When God uses distance to strengthen your faith, there is another painful truth about distance from family that many people struggle to understand. Sometimes God allows that distance because He is strengthening something inside you. Faith grows differently in loneliness than it does in comfort. When life feels stable and everyone around you agrees with you, faith can feel easy. But when the people closest to you no longer understand your path, something deeper begins to happen inside your soul. You are forced to choose. Will you follow God, or will you follow the approval of people? This is one of the quiet tests of spiritual maturity. Many believers think faith is proven only through suffering from enemies or hardships. But often the hardest test comes when the tension comes from those you love. Because love naturally wants harmony. You want peace in your home. You want your family to understand you. You want the people closest to you to support the path you feel God is calling you to walk. But sometimes they do not. Sometimes they question you. Sometimes they misunderstand you. Sometimes they quietly withdraw from you because the person you are becoming no longer fits the image they once had of you. And that moment can break your heart. Yet the Bible shows us that this moment is not meaningless. It is often the place where faith becomes real. When Jacob wrestled with God in the night, he was completely alone. No family, no friends, no one to help him. Only him and God. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. Genesis chapter 32 verse 24. That night changed Jacob forever. Before that moment, Jacob depended on cleverness, strategy, and the support of people around him. But in that lonely struggle, God transformed his identity. He even gave him a new name, Israel. Sometimes God removes the familiar support around you for the same reason. Not to punish you, but to transform you. Because when human support disappears, you begin to discover whether your faith is truly rooted in God. If your strength comes from people's approval, distance will feel unbearable. But if your strength comes from God, distance becomes a place of spiritual growth. Another reason God sometimes allows family distance is to protect the calling placed on your life. Every calling requires courage, but courage rarely grows in environments where you are constantly pulled back into the expectations of others. Your family may love you deeply, but sometimes their fears become chains around your destiny. They may want you to stay safe, to stay close, to remain the person they understand. But God may be calling you somewhere they cannot yet see. This happened with Joseph. When Joseph began to receive dreams from God, even his own brothers could not accept it. Instead of celebrating his calling, they rejected him. They sold him into slavery and separated him from his family completely. At that moment, it looked like Joseph had lost everything. But the distance that seemed like betrayal was actually preparation. Years later, Joseph would stand in a position of authority in Egypt and save his entire family from famine. The separation that once felt cruel became part of God's greater plan. This is one of the mysterious ways God works. Sometimes the distance that hurts the most is the very thing God uses to prepare you for the purpose He has already written for your life. In those lonely seasons, it can feel like you are walking a road no one else understands. But the Bible reminds us of something comforting. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Psalm chapter 34 verse 18. God never abandons the people He is preparing. In fact, He often draws closest during the seasons when everyone else feels far away. So if you are experiencing distance from your family right now, it does not always mean something is broken. It may mean something is being built. Your faith, your identity, your calling. Because sometimes God separates you for a season, so that He can shape you for a destiny you cannot yet see. And in that quiet place where loneliness once lived, God begins to build a strength inside you that no human relationship could ever create. When God uses distance to reveal your true purpose, there is something many people only realize years later. Some of the most painful distances in life were actually the moments when God was quietly revealing their true purpose. At first, separation feels like loss. It feels like something important has been taken away from you. The voices that once encouraged you become silent. The people who once walked beside you begin to drift away. And in that silence, you may ask a difficult question. Why would God allow this? But the Bible shows us that purpose is often revealed in the very seasons where comfort disappears. God rarely reveals destiny in places where we are completely comfortable. Comfort keeps us still. Purpose moves us forward. And sometimes the only way God can move you toward your calling is by loosening the ties that keep you anchored to what is familiar. This is exactly what happened to Moses. Before he became the leader who would guide Israel out of slavery, Moses lost everything that once defined him. He was raised in the palace of Egypt, surrounded by privilege and security. But one moment changed everything. He fled into the wilderness and spent years far away from the life he once knew. No palace, no recognition, no clear direction, just silence, just waiting, just a desert. From the outside, it looked like Moses' life had fallen apart. But in reality, God was preparing him. The wilderness was not punishment. It was training. It was there, in the quiet desert, that Moses encountered God at the burning bush. The moment that would change the history of an entire nation happened in a place of isolation. This pattern appears again and again throughout Scripture. David was anointed as king when he was still a young shepherd. Yet after receiving that calling, he did not immediately sit on the throne. Instead, he spent years running, hiding, and living in places far from the life he expected. The distance between the promise and the fulfillment was where God shaped his character. Because purpose without preparation can destroy a person, God prepares the heart before He reveals the assignment. And often, that preparation happens in lonely seasons. Seasons when no one applauds you. Seasons when no one fully understands what God is doing in your life. But those quiet seasons are not wasted. They are sacred. They are the hidden chapters where God writes the strength, wisdom, and endurance you will need later. Even Jesus experienced distance before stepping into His public mission. The Bible tells us that before beginning His ministry, Jesus went into the wilderness for 40 days. There was no crowd, no disciples, no recognition, only silence and preparation. Because before purpose is revealed, the soul must be strengthened. When family distance appears in your life, it can feel like the story is falling apart. But sometimes it is actually the moment when God begins writing a new chapter. A chapter where your identity is no longer defined by expectations around you. A chapter where your decisions are guided by God's voice rather than human approval. And slowly, in that quiet space, something begins to change inside you. Your faith becomes stronger. Your vision becomes clearer. Your heart becomes more focused on the purpose God placed inside you. What once felt like loneliness becomes direction. What once felt like confusion becomes calling. And one day, you may look back at the distance that once broke your heart and realize something surprising. That painful separation was not the end of your story. It was the beginning of the purpose God had been preparing for you all along. Because sometimes the road to your calling begins with distance, so that when the moment finally arrives, you will be ready to walk into the destiny God prepared for you long before you understood it. When distance becomes part of God's greater plan. In the end, distance from family is one of the most painful experiences a person can face. It touches the deepest parts of the heart, because family is where we expect to feel understood, supported, and loved without conditions. So when silence replaces closeness, when misunderstanding replaces warmth, when the people who once stood beside you now feel far away, the pain can feel overwhelming. But the Bible gently reminds us of something important. God never allows pain without purpose. Every season in your life, especially the difficult ones, is part of a greater story that God is writing. Sometimes distance is where faith becomes stronger. Sometimes distance is where identity becomes clearer. Sometimes distance is where God protects your soul from influences you cannot yet see. And sometimes distance is simply the path God uses to guide you toward the purpose He prepared long before you were born. The truth is, many of the people God used most powerfully in Scripture walked through seasons of relational distance. Abraham left his homeland. Joseph was separated from his brothers. Moses spent years alone in the wilderness. David lived as a fugitive before becoming king. Even Jesus experienced rejection from those who knew Him best. Their stories remind us that distance is not always a sign that something has gone wrong. Sometimes it is the quiet evidence that God is moving your life in a direction others cannot yet understand. And even when human relationships shift, one promise in the Bible never changes. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Psalm chapter 34 verse 18. God sees every tear. He understands every moment of loneliness. And He walks beside you even in the seasons when you feel completely alone. One day, you may look back at this painful chapter and realize something you could not see before. The distance that once hurt so deeply was the very path that led you closer to God, closer to your purpose, closer to the person you were always meant to become. Because in God's hands, even the most painful separation can become a doorway, not away from love, but toward a deeper love, a stronger faith, and a life shaped by the purpose He prepared for you from the very beginning.